I've spent years sitting across from people who built enormous fortunes, founders, investors, people who started with nothing and ended up controlling companies worth more than some countries' entire economies. And somewhere around the 40th or 50th conversation like that, I started noticing something that nobody in any of those rooms ever said out loud, something none of the biographies mention, something that never makes it into the keynote speech or the LinkedIn post. It's not about hustle. It's not about waking up at 5 in the morning. It's not even really about intelligence, although most of them are frighteningly smart. It's something quieter, something almost embarrassing to admit. And once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it in almost every single person who has ever built something enormous out of nothing. Almost none of them were building towards something. Almost all of them were running from something. I want to sit with that sentence for a second, because I think most people hear it and assume it's a throwaway line, a bit of psychology-flavored garnish on top of a success story. It isn't. I think it might be the single most consistent, most under-discussed pattern in extreme achievement, and I think ignoring it is quietly costing a huge number of ambitious people their health, their relationships, and in some cases, their lives. I want to spend the next hour actually walking you through it properly, because I don't think a single line does it justice, and I don't think you'll believe me unless I show you exactly how I arrived at it, one room at a time. Let me tell you how I actually noticed this, because it didn't arrive as a theory. It arrived as a feeling I kept having in the room, over and over, that something wasn't adding up. I'd sit with someone worth more money than they could spend across 10 lifetimes, someone who by every external measure had already won, completely, undeniably, and I'd ask a fairly ordinary question. Something like, when do you feel like you've made it? And almost without exception, I'd watch a flick across their face before the polished answer came out. A flicker of something that looked less like satisfaction and more like fatigue. And on the rare occasions where someone let their guard down enough to actually answer the real question, the answer was never, I already feel like I've made it. It was some version of not yet. Not yet, even at a scale that should make not yet impossible to say with a straight face. And that not yet is the thread I started pulling on, because if external success isn't producing the feeling external success is supposed to produce, then something else is actually driving the engine. And once I started asking about that something else, directly, gently, patiently, the pattern showed up so consistently, it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like the actual subject I should be studying more than the businesses themselves. Here's what it usually sounds like, underneath the surface, once someone trusts you enough to say it plainly. It sounds like a memory of being poor in a specific, humiliating way, not just having less money, but a specific moment, a specific look on someone's face, a specific instant of being made to feel small because of it. It sounds like a parent who was never satisfied, no matter what was achieved. So satisfaction itself became a moving target that could never quite be reached, which meant the only available strategy was to keep moving. It sounds like being the kid who got overlooked, or laughed at, or told directly that they wouldn't amount to anything, and building an entire adult life as a kind of rebuttal to a sentence someone said to them when they were 11 years old. It sounds like grief, sometimes dressed up as ambition, the death of a parent too early, a family that fell apart, an unstable childhood that left a specific kind of hunger that money quietly promised to fill, even though, if you actually ask, it never fully did. I want to be precise about what I'm not saying, because this is the part where people usually misunderstand this pattern. I am not saying every successful person had a traumatic childhood, and I am not saying trauma is some kind of secret requirement for building something enormous. Plenty of people carry real pain and never build anything at all, and that pain is just as real and just as valid without a company attached to it. What I am saying is something narrower and, I think, more useful. Among the people who reach truly extreme, outlier levels of achievement, not comfortable success, but the kind that reshapes industries, an unusually high number of them are running an engine that was originally built to solve an emotional problem, not a business problem. The business became the vehicle. It was never actually the destination. Now, over time, I started noticing that this running from something pattern isn't just one single shape. It shows up in a few distinct flavors, and I think it's worth walking through them separately, because you'll probably recognize yourself or someone close to you in at least one of them. The first flavor I'd call the provider wound. This is the person who grew up watching a parent, usually, though not always, a father fail to provide or fail in a very public, humiliating way financially. Maybe there was a bankruptcy. Maybe there was a period of real hunger, of eviction notices, of a specific memory of a utility being cut off, of clothes that were clearly secondhand in a school where that was noticed and commented on. The person carrying this wound doesn't just want money, they want the specific structural safety of never again being at the mercy of circumstances outside their control. And what's fascinating is that this type very often keeps building long after any reasonable definition of safety has been achieved, because the fear was never really about a number. It was about a feeling of powerlessness, and no amount of zeros in a bank account can fully erase the memory of being a child who had no control over whether the light stayed on. The second flavor I'd call the invisibility wound. This is the person who wasn't necessarily poor, but who felt profoundly unseen, the middle child, the quiet one, the one who got decent but not exceptional grades and was never really talked about at family dinners the way a sibling was. This person's engine isn't really about money at all. Money is just the most legible scoreboard available in this culture. What they're actually chasing is being impossible to ignore. You'll notice this type is often obsessed with recognition, with press, with being known, in a way that goes well beyond what's useful for the business. They'll take a worse financial deal if it comes with more visibility. That's not vanity in the shallow sense people assume. It's a decades-old attempt to finally be seen by an audience big enough that it can't possibly overlook them the way one particular audience once did. The third flavor I'd call the humiliation wound, and this one is maybe the most explosive of the three. This is the person who has one specific memory, often shockingly precise, of being mocked, dismissed, or told directly that they would fail. A teacher who said it in front of the class, an early business partner who laughed at an idea, a rejection letter, a fired-on-the-spot moment, a specific person who said the specific words, "You'll never make it." I have sat across from people worth astronomical sums who can recite that sentence, word for word, decades later, in the exact tone it was said to them. And their entire career, when you really trace it back, is a slow-motion, multi-decade rebuttal to that one sentence. The tragic irony is that the person who said it, in almost every case, doesn't remember saying it at all. They've moved on completely. The wound they left behind is still running an empire, entirely without their knowledge. And the fourth flavor, which took me the longest to recognize because it hides so well, I'd call the chaos wound. This is the person who grew up in genuine instability, not necessarily poverty, but unpredictability. A parent with addiction. A household where the emotional temperature could change in an instant, where you never quite knew, walking through the front door, what version of your family you'd find that day. This person's engine isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about control. Building something enormous gives them a domain, however large, where the rules are theirs, where they can't be blindsided the way they were blindsided as a child. You'll notice this type is often the hardest to work for, not because they're cruel, but because their nervous system reads any loss of control as a five-alarm threat in a way that has nothing to do with the actual stakes of the situation in front of them. I lay these four out not because I think they're the only four, or because real people fit neatly into one box. Most people I've met are some blend of two or three, but because I want you to see that underneath the single word ambition, there are actually very specific, very personal stories running the machine, and almost nobody in these people's professional lives ever asks which one is theirs. Here's the part that took me the longest to really understand, the part that I think is the actual pattern. Almost nobody talks about because it's uncomfortable and it doesn't fit neatly into a motivational quote. That engine works. It genuinely, powerfully works, at least for a while, regardless of which flavor it is. Pain, it turns out, is one of the most reliable fuel sources a human being can run on. It doesn't need external validation to keep going. It doesn't get tired the way ordinary motivation gets tired, because it isn't chasing a reward, it's fleeing a wound, and fleeing has a different kind of endurance to it than chasing does. You can run from something for decades. That's precisely why so many of the most extreme outcomes in business come from people who, on paper, had every reason to stop and rest and simply didn't, because resting meant sitting still long enough to feel the thing they'd built the entire company to outrun. But here's the twist, and this is the piece nobody puts in the highlight reel. The wound that built the empire is almost never the same size as the empire. A feeling of not being enough, formed at age 9, does not get resolved by a company worth $1 billion, because the company was never actually built to address that feeling directly. It was built to distract from it, to drown it out, to prove something to a version of a parent or a classmate or a younger self who, in most cases, isn't even paying attention anymore, if they ever were. So what happens again and again in room after room is that people hit the number. They hit the number they were sure would finally make the old feeling go quiet, and the old feeling doesn't go quiet. It just gets a little harder to hear over the noise of everything else they've built. And so the very natural, very human response is to build more on the theory that the number simply wasn't big enough yet. I've sat across from people worth what most of us would consider an unimaginable, unspendable fortune and watched them describe an anxiety about falling behind that would sound out of context, exactly like someone worth nothing at all. Let me give you a version of this that isn't about billionaires, because I don't want you to file this away as something that only applies to people in a different universe from yours. This shows up at every scale. The person who finally hits their first 6 figures and instead of relief, feels an immediate, unsettling need for 7. The person who finally gets the promotion they'd been chasing for years and, within about a month, is already quietly scanning for the next one, unable to explain why the achievement they wanted so badly for so long produced about 4 days of satisfaction before it evaporated. If you've ever hit a goal you were completely sure would change how you feel, and it simply didn't, not in the way you expected, that's not a personal failure. That's the exact mechanism I'm describing, just at a smaller scale than a company worth billions. The mechanism doesn't care how large the number is. It only knows how to chase, never how to arrive. I remember one conversation in particular that made all of this click into place for me. I was talking with someone who had built and sold multiple companies, someone genuinely brilliant, someone whose name you would recognize instantly if I said it. And I asked what almost felt like a throwaway question toward the end of a long conversation. What does your inner voice actually sound like, day to day, underneath the confidence everyone sees from the outside? And there was this long pause. And then this person who had built things that employed thousands of people and touched the lives of millions said something I have never forgotten. They said the voice never really changed. It sounded exactly the same at 10 million as it did at 10,000. It said the same thing. Not enough. Not yet. Don't stop. The scenery around the voice had changed completely. The voice itself hadn't moved an inch. That conversation stayed with me for weeks, and it made me start asking a slightly different question in every conversation after that. Instead of asking people what drove them, I started asking what they were afraid would happen if they stopped. And the answers were remarkably consistent and remarkably revealing. Almost nobody said, "I'm afraid the company would fail." What they actually said, in one form or another, was some version of, "I'm afraid of who I'd be without this." Stopping wasn't framed as a business risk. It was framed as an identity risk, sometimes even an extinction level one, as if the person underneath the achievement was somehow smaller, less real, less safe than the achievement itself. And I think that fear, more than any strategic insight, more than any market opportunity, is the actual engine behind an enormous amount of what gets celebrated as elite performance. I want to talk for a moment about why this pattern is so hard to see from the outside, because I think that's actually part of why it persists. Extreme achievement produces a kind of narrative gravity around itself. Once someone is worth an enormous sum, or runs a company that changes an industry, the story that gets told about them by journalists, by biographers, by the person themselves in interviews, retroactively reorganizes their entire life into a clean arc of vision, grit, and destiny. Nobody writes the version of the story that says, "I built this because I was terrified of an 11-year-old memory, and I still am." That version doesn't sell books. It doesn't make a good keynote. So the wound gets quietly edited out, and what's left is a polished narrative of ambition that looks, from a distance, like something purely aspirational, something with no cost attached to it at all. Which means that everyone watching, everyone climbing their own smaller ladder and looking up at these stories for inspiration, absorbs a completely incomplete picture. They see the empire. They never see the voice that built it, still whispering the same sentence it whispered 30 years ago. I want to be honest about why I think this matters, and why I don't think this is just an interesting observation about rich people that has nothing to do with you. I think this pattern is quietly running underneath an enormous amount of ordinary ambition too. The extra hours, the inability to switch off, the guilt that shows up the moment you try to rest, the way achievement feels good for about a week and then the bar silently moves. And I think if you don't examine where your own drive is actually coming from, You risk spending decades of real effort solving a problem that effort was never designed to solve. You can build an extraordinary career as a genuinely brilliant, elegant, expensive way of avoiding a feeling, and it will look, from the outside, exactly like ambition. Nobody watching will be able to tell the difference. For a long time, you might not be able to tell the difference either. There's a specific moment that tends to force the question, and I've watched it happen enough times now that I can almost predict when it's coming. It's usually not the achievement itself that cracks the pattern open. It's the first real taste of arrival, the sale of the company, the number finally hit, the recognition finally received, followed by a silence, a gap where the striving used to be. And in that gap, for the first time in years, sometimes decades, the original feeling has nowhere left to hide. I've heard this described as the strangest kind of grief, grieving something you got, not something you lost. People describe it as waking up the morning after the deal closed and feeling, instead of triumph, a kind of quiet, bewildering flatness. And underneath the flatness, unmistakably, the exact same voice from childhood, completely undisturbed by the outcome, as if the entire achievement had happened in a different room, and this feeling had simply been waiting here the whole time for them to come back. Some people run from that gap immediately, straight into the next venture, the next fund, the next impossible goal, before they've had time to actually sit inside the silence and ask what it's telling them. And I understand why. The silence is genuinely unbearable if you've spent 30 years building an entire identity around outrunning it. But the people I've met who eventually found something like real peace, and there are some, it's not hopeless, it's just rare, were almost always the ones who, at some point, forced themselves to sit inside that gap instead of sprinting past it. They let the old feeling catch up to them, finally, on purpose, usually with real support around them, and they discovered something that I think is the actual core lesson underneath everything I've described tonight. The feeling was never actually about money, so money was never going to be able to resolve it, no matter how large the number got. Once they addressed the original wound directly, through therapy, through honest reckoning with family, through the slow, unglamorous work of grieving what happened to them, the drive to keep building didn't necessarily disappear, but it changed character entirely. It stopped being a flight and started being a choice. And those, it turns out, feel completely different from the inside, even if they look identical from the outside. I also want to talk about the people around someone caught in this pattern, because I think they carry an invisible cost too, one that almost never gets discussed. The partner who married someone mid-flight, before the pattern was visible, and slowly watched every milestone fail to produce the relief that was promised, over and over, year after year. The children who grow up watching a parent chase a feeling that never arrives, and who absorb without anyone meaning to teach them the same quiet lesson, that love and safety are conditional on achievement, that rest is dangerous, that stopping means becoming someone smaller. I've spoken to adult children of extraordinarily successful people who describe a strange, specific grief of their own, growing up with every material advantage imaginable, and somehow still inheriting the exact same hunger, the exact same inability to feel finished, without ever experiencing the original wound that created it in their parent. The pattern, left unexamined, doesn't just cost the person running it. It has a habit of quietly copying itself into the next generation, like a virus that doesn't need the original trauma to replicate, only the behavior built on top of it. So let me try to actually be useful here, because I don't want to leave you with just a diagnosis and no direction. Here's what I've come to believe, after watching this pattern show up in room after room, across every level of wealth and success I've been lucky enough to witness up close. First, get honest with yourself about what's actually driving the effort, without judging yourself for the answer. Ask yourself plainly, if I hit this specific goal, do I actually believe I will feel different, or do I just hope I will? Those are two very different feelings, and most people, if they're honest, know exactly which one they're operating from. Hope that keeps getting disappointed at every new level is usually a sign the goal isn't the actual target, it's a stand-in for something the goal was never built to deliver. Second, notice the specific age the wound seems to be coming from. This sounds strange, but it's remarkably clarifying. When you feel that jolt of not enough, pause and ask how old that feeling actually feels. Is this the voice of a competent adult assessing a real, present situation, Or is this an 11-year-old who got humiliated once and never got the apology or the resolution they needed? People are often shocked, once they actually sit with the question, at how young that voice sounds. And once you can name its age, it becomes much harder for it to quietly run your entire adult life without your permission. Third, try to identify which flavor is actually yours, out of the ones I described. Are you running from a fear of powerlessness, the provider wound, a fear of being overlooked, the invisibility wound, a specific humiliation you're still quietly rebutting, or a childhood without stable ground beneath it, and a need for control that goes far beyond what any present situation actually requires? Naming the specific shape of it takes away a huge amount of its power, because vague, unnamed fear can attach itself to literally anything. Named, specific fear can finally be addressed directly, on its own terms, instead of endlessly, expensively being outsourced to your career. Fourth, separate the engine from the destination, deliberately and on purpose. It's completely fine to use a painful memory as fuel. Plenty of extraordinary things have been built that way, and I'm not telling you to throw away a source of drive that has genuinely served you. What I am telling you is to stop expecting the destination to fix the engine. Build the company, hit the number, win the thing, and go into it with your eyes open, knowing in advance that arriving will not automatically produce peace. If you know that ahead of time, you won't spend the 6 months after the win confused and quietly ashamed that you don't feel the way you were promised you'd feel. Fifth, and this is the one people resist the most, actually go address the original wound directly, separately from the achievement, on its own terms. Therapy, honest conversations with the people involved if that's even possible, or simply the slow internal work of grieving what happened and deciding it no longer gets to set the terms of your self-worth. This is the only path I've ever seen actually change the sound of that inner voice. Rather than just making it louder and richer, money changes the scenery around the voice. It has never, in a single case I've witnessed, changed what the voice says. Sixth, build at least one relationship in your life where you are not performing achievement at all, where nobody involved cares what you've built or what you're worth, and protect that relationship carefully. Almost everyone I've described in this pattern has a version of this missing entirely from their life, because every relationship became, at some point, entangled with the empire. A friend, a partner, occasionally even a parent, who genuinely could not care less about the number and simply wants to know how you actually are, is one of the few reliable ways to keep any part of yourself separate from the machine long enough to notice it's a machine at all. Seventh, if you have children, or plan to pay close attention to what you're actually teaching them about rest, about enoughness, about what happens in your household on the days you don't achieve anything at all. Children learn almost nothing from what you tell them explicitly, and almost everything from what they observe you doing when nobody's watching. If the only version of you they ever see is the one still chasing the next thing, that's the inheritance they'll receive, whether or not a single word about it is ever spoken out loud. I want to end with something one of the people I spoke to said, almost as an afterthought, right at the end of a long conversation, after I'd already turned the recorder off. They said the tragedy isn't that ambitious people are running from something. Running from something built entire industries, cured diseases, employed millions of people, and there's real, undeniable good in that. The tragedy is that so few of them ever stop long enough to notice they're running, let alone to ask what would happen if, just once, they turned around and actually looked at the thing behind them instead of building the next wall to hide it. Because in almost every single case, the thing behind them wasn't as big as the empire built to escape it. It was just a moment, a sentence, someone said, a door that closed, a parent who couldn't be satisfied, and it had been waiting, patiently, the entire time, for someone to finally turn around. If any part of this landed with you, I gently ask you to do the one thing almost none of the people I've described ever did in time. Stop, just for a moment, right now, wherever you're watching this, and ask yourself, honestly, what you're actually building toward and what you're actually running from. They are very often not the same thing, and knowing the difference, I think, might be worth more than the next zero on whatever number you're chasing, and more than the next title, the next milestone, the next thing you've quietly promised yourself will finally be enough. Because I've sat across from people who reached the very top of that ladder, the actual top, the place the rest of us are told is the destination, and the voice was still there, waiting for them, exactly as loud as the day it first showed up. The only difference between them and everyone still climbing is that some of them, eventually, had the courage to turn around and actually look at it. And the ones who did, without exception, are the only ones I've ever met at that level of success who also seemed, underneath everything, genuinely at peace.